and figured they're going to die, and they would bring the ones just coming down with disease, put them down in the bottom of the hole. And the ones on the deck, big for water, and so they began to give them water and splash water over them, and they got well. So the ship doctor attempted to share this information with other sea captains and ship doctors. It didn't go very far. It was standard therapy, and you weren't to change. Vincent Prinznetz of Austria, a young boy of around 13 years of age, went through an accident, and he discovered that putting his limb that had been injured in cold water reduced the pain and the swelling. And he then thereafter began experimenting. And eventually, as an adult, he formed a treatment center. And it became famous, and doctors and people from various nations around the world would come to learn his water therapy treatments. And it was from that point that the water therapy in the early the late 1800s was in New England area on that part. And so here finally a breakthrough in some alternative therapies was recognized, and hydrotherapy grew out of that particular, and you're all very familiar with that. When I took medicine, we had over 100 hours of hydrotherapy training. It was a great interest. We enjoyed the class. Those teachings are not there any longer. In every nursing station, and those nurses here that took training long ago that know that in every nursing station there was a big vat of boiling water where you had these big fomentations you'd wring out, and you'd go give fomentations to the patients. And it was tremendous for solving post-surgical gas, or the abdomen would be filled with gas and it wouldn't move out. And you'd put those big packs across the abdomen, and return flow, and the gas would move out, and pain was relieved. Tremendous. It's just not done any longer, unfortunately. In 1833, thereabouts, a Sylvester Graham, a minister, began to promote the using of whole grains. You ever hear of graham flour, graham crackers, graham bread? He helped establish Oberlin College, and they had a vegetarian diet. I'm sure the Lord gave that to him. It's just exactly what was given to us. Why that was not continued on, we don't know, but the college dropped those practices. But early on in the 1830s, this particular area was an alternative therapy location that could have been far more benefit than it was. But somehow the college lost its way. There we go. Let's take ourselves up here. Well, I'm going to skip up to here. Let's come up now in the years when the great movement looking for the second coming of Christ occurred, and then there was the disappointment, and then there was a small group of people for 11 years were studying the Bible to find out why the disappointment. And during that time, as you know, Ellen White was given the first health message. There we are. So Ellen White, and in 1848, the first message on health was given. This was not a church yet. That church did not establish till 1863. But in 1848, while they were studying, her first message that God gave was on tobacco, coffee, and tea. Why? There were many other things. You would say, well, what about pork or something else? These affected the mind, and they were studying and trying to get a clear understanding of the Scriptures. And so God directed them to avoid those things would alter their thinking. And that was the first message that came. But tobacco was a slow one to get out of the church. It took 15 years before the church was free of tobacco usage among the members. So God was patient with the group. During this time, there were people that read the Bible and said, well, look, we're told not to use swine, not to use the pig. But God sent a message, and he says, leave it alone. I'll bring that in its proper time. Bringing certain things in too soon would have disrupted the growth and accepted. We don't know all of the things, access they had to different foods. And so God knew best, and they followed that advice. But it's mentioned here that God would not accept in his kingdom to come those that would be smoking. 15 years to put it away. Okay, we got ahead on our story, ahead of our pictures here. It doesn't want to move very fast. There, that's going the wrong. All right. Now our second health vision in 1854. And surprising what this was on. Let's see if the slide comes up to show us. All right, the first part of this vision was on cleanliness of home and of body. That was a condition, a time where you didn't have a shower in the room. You had to heat the water in the tub. As a boy, I can remember, we for years just had a tub. We carried the water, brought it out of the well, and you hope to not be the last one in the tub. Some of you remember those days, according to where you lived. All right, what else was in that particular vision? All right, to avoid grease. What was grease in those days? Primarily lard. It could be beef lard, or it could be the lard from the pig. So avoid that. And then there was something else to avoid. Let's see what that was. We can get there. To use coarse grains and avoid the fine grains, and to avoid overeating. Now, what is a coarse grain? Nobody quite knows for sure, but most likely this was the coarse would be where you ground your wheat and hadn't been filtered through the fine silk filtering system to get the white pure. So here, very early on, to use a whole grain was a part, even before we had a church, 1858. And interesting, the last 15 years or so, the national government and the dietetic associations are pushing whole grains. For years, that was ignored. And I remember attending a nutrition congress in Miami where 70 people from, it was 1974, and people from 34 nations, they were the researchers. And I mentioned something there about avoiding the refined and using the whole grain, and I was laughed at by the dietitians there. But fortunately, they changed. Now, all of you were raised probably, many of you in the Adventist church, and you heard it from the time you were young. I did. We didn't know all the reasons why, but God said, here's something to avoid the refined flours. Then we go on to the next vision that brought in the health report. But first we have this, and I have a hard time, that's a little small, so I'm going to turn and read. I saw that God was purifying unto himself a peculiar people in whom he can delight. He will have a clean and holy people. I saw that God would not acknowledge an untidy, unclean person as a Christian. So as time went along, the blessings of God, as he was giving spiritual knowledge, he was also blessing the people with physical well-being. This has been our God throughout time. Obeying his spiritual laws is the same. If we obey his physical, it's still being in obedience to our Creator. Our souls, bodies, and spirits are to be preserved blameless by Jesus to his Father, presented to his Father, and unless we are clean in person and pure, we cannot be presented blameless to the Father. The General Conference was organized in 1863. 2 weeks later, in this house, Ellen White had her third vision on health, a long vision, which opened the whole panorama of the purpose of it. The first information there on coffee, tea, tobacco, then on cleanliness, on the fats and on the whole grains, and now a widespread knowledge of health practices and to begin to have health institutions. This came about in 1863. This was in a worship service, and she went into vision and over a prolonged period of time. But what was more important in this message that was not in the others is how directly important this message was to the salvation, to the acceptance of God's salvation, to be in physical health, to be in harmony with His physical laws and chemical laws. Not only would it give you better brain, better understanding, but this was God's design to be for the foods and things that He had given us. So that put us in harmony with there. And it was a part of the third angel's message. She says, I was again shown that our health reform in one branch is of the great work, which is to fit us as a people for the coming of the Lord, is as closely connected with the third angel's message as the hand is with the body. What I want to do later tomorrow, I want to present to you and expose the counterfeit of what God is giving His people. And today, the place that has placed us in the eyes of the world, of the scientific world, is on a pinnacle. We have had great advantages, lifespan and so forth. But in our church and among our members is sweeping something out of the East that has no history of benefit, but coming in like it was an answer to prayer that members not recognizing or being deceived by. And so my whole program this weekend is to help understand that. When it first started coming in, I didn't understand it. And I spent years trying to. I couldn't find anybody else that really understood it. Oh, everybody was making judgments by whether you got better or not. But if the devil does something and does a miracle, you can't make a judgment if somebody gets well from it. That you're real in jeopardy if you use that as the guide, because he can do real things. You have to use the scriptures to understand it, to look at its background. And that's what tomorrow we will be showing you how to do that and what that part is. I'm going to need to turn here to read. He, God, designs that the great subject of health reform shall be agitated and the public mind deeply stirred to investigate, for it is impossible for men and women with all their sinful, health-destroying, brain-enervating habits to discern sacred truth through which they are to be sanctified, refined, made fit for the society of heavenly angels in the kingdom of glory. In 1866 in our church there was a health institution started, the Western Health Reform Institute. Also the church began to write a journal that was sent out to the members to promote health, style of life. This was the first institution, a picture of it. Interesting. They look at their clothing, the long dresses, and so forth. In the building in the back, I think, was a hydrotherapy. They had built that on there, but that was the first institution. Started in 1866. And in selected messages, again, it's a little too small back there for me to read. The way in which Christ worked was to preach the word and to relieve suffering by miraculous works of healing. But I am instructed that we cannot now work in this way, for Satan will exercise his power by working miracles. God's servants today could not work by means of miracles. Why? Because spurious works of healing, claiming to be divine, will be wrought. And that's what we will be hoping to expose tomorrow. For this reason, the Lord has marked out a way in which His people are to carry forward a work of physical healing combined with the teaching of the Word. Sanitariums are to be established. There God would be given the credit for benefit for getting well rather than man. And that was the purpose of those. Angels will attend the patients, helpers, and the physicians. And so I think of Weimar, trying to follow God's plan. You heard of miraculous things happening, things that ordinarily we don't see as physicians in our treatment. I think the answer is right in front of you. Angels will help. Things will happen that don't ordinarily happen. And so we give thanks to God for that.
Amen.
The Health Institute as an educational center. Physicians were to have the highest training possible. There were to be no novices to be connected with the health reform work. This was back, remember, in the earlier days, as the Health Institute had been established, and then the first thing they needed and were desperate for was Christian nurses. And soon they began to teach nursing training. Following that, they had a course in public health, which many students would come for 3 months and then go back to the churches to teach public health. Eventually, there we go. Eventually, there was the establishment of the medical school, American Medical College, at Battle Creek in 1895. But let's look at the treatment that was God recommended for this health institution that opened in 1866. The therapy, exercise, walking primarily, hydrotherapy, a vegetarian diet, whole grains, nuts, no alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or tea. And what's important, some of those treatments and medical therapy, so-called, that I will speak about and expose tomorrow, were present in this day, but God didn't direct those to be practiced in the sanitarium. The yoga, the acupuncture, all of those. They've been around for ages, but God didn't direct. In fact, a lot of information was given Ellen White exposing them, the very basics of them, and we'll be relating to those later. All right, we see here the timetable. Battle Creek Sanitarium started 1866. School of Health opened 78, 83, the School of Nursing, and 1895, the School of Medicine opened, the American Medical College. And then the medical students, as they graduated, began to go out through the United States, Canada, and in the world and begin to establish. We had sanitariums all over the place. In the Northwest, there were many sanitariums established in the more Northwest. Eventually, they came down to Walla Walla and Portland. Those are the only ones left. But in the early days, they were scattered, and they were in Canada as well.